Picture this. You are Lucius Coranius, a Roman envoy, standing in the middle of a so-called barbarian court. Marble and togas are 1,000 miles away. Here it's salt air, hard eyes, and warriors who don't flinch. And you have just made a fatal mistake. Because you're not here to negotiate. You're here to dictate. Across from you sits Queen Teuta, ruler of the RDA, a pirate kingdom that Rome barely respects and barely understands. Your job is simple: intimidate her, force her into submission, make her leash her people. The air is tight with tension as you step forward, every bit the Roman aristocrat, every bit convinced that Rome owns the world now. You sneer. You declare that if she refuses to control her subjects, then Rome will simply teach her how to rule. You expect fear. You expect her to shrink under the weight of your empire. Instead, she smiles. It's thin, cold, the kind of smile that never reaches her eyes. And then she dismisses you with a lazy flick of her hand, like you're nothing more than an annoying fly. You turn on your heel and march back to your ship, convinced you've delivered your message, convinced she'll fold the moment you're gone. And you're right. You did deliver a message, just not the one you intended. As you step onto the gangplank, sunlight flashing across the Adriatic, you don't see the assassin sliding out from the shadow beneath the hull. You only feel the sudden burn of steel cutting across your throat. Your hands fly to your neck. Warm blood spills through your fingers. You try to breathe, but you only gargle. You collapse onto the deck, choking, helpless, while Teuta's guards watch with dead, indifferent eyes. You are the first Roman diplomat to be butchered in cold blood in decades. And as your vision darkens, one horrifying truth hits you. You didn't just insult a queen. You just started a war with the most dangerous sailors in the ancient world, the Illyrians. Before we dive deeper into these forgotten stories of survival, pride, and suffering, if you love uncovering the hidden truths of history, hit that like button, subscribe, and comment below where you're listening from. Because honestly, it blows my mind that we can explore ancient worlds together from every corner of the planet, connected across time by curiosity. Now, that murder in 230 BC wasn't just a crime. It was a slap across the face of the Mediterranean's newest superpower. Rome had only recently finished strangling Carthage to death in the First Punic War. The Senate was drunk on victory. They looked at the map and saw the Mediterranean not as an ocean, but as their private swimming pool. And to them, the tribes across the Adriatic Sea weren't threats. They were nuisances, gnats buzzing around the head of a lion. But these were no ordinary gnats, because while Roman legions were perfecting the art of infantry warfare on land, the Illyrians were rewriting the rules of naval combat. Operating from the jagged, island-choked coastline of modern-day Dalmatia, they had turned piracy into a state-sponsored industry. They didn't raid for adventure. They raided to survive. Because the rocky soil of the Balkans couldn't support massive agriculture. So they did what they had to do. They harvested the sea. Every merchant ship sailing from Greece to Italy had to pass through their waters. And that meant every merchant ship was prey. Under King Agron, the RDI tribe had forged desperate raiding parties into something much worse, a terrifying pirate confederacy. Agron was a warlord of the old breed, violent, magnetic, and addicted to unmixed wine. And after a massive victory against the Atlians, he celebrated so hard that he drank himself into sickness. He developed pleurisy and died within days. Suddenly the throne fell to his wife, Teuta. Rome saw opportunity. Reports flooded the Senate. Italian merchants were being dragged from their ships and sold into slavery. The Senate assumed this queen regent would be easy to bully, a widow in a barbarian kingdom. So they dispatched the Carnius brothers, two aristocrats dripping with Roman arrogance. They sailed to Scodra to give orders, not to bargain. And the meeting that followed was a collision between two completely incompatible worlds. The Romans demanded Teuta stop the piracy immediately. Teuta stared back at them, honestly confused, because in Aryan culture, piracy wasn't shameful. It was legitimate trade, a private enterprise like pottery or fishing, and she explained it plainly. It wasn't the custom of kings to prevent their subjects from winning booty. To her, the Romans were asking her to destroy her own economy. But the younger Carinius snapped. He insulted her. He insulted her laws. And without even realizing it, he threatened invasion. He treated Teuta like an unruly vassal, not a sovereign queen. Teuta didn't explode. She didn't scream. She simply made a decision. This Roman insolence needed a permanent correction. And so, on the walk back to the ship, Lucius Carinius died. When news reached Rome, the Senate was stunned into silence. Killing an envoy wasn't just provocative. It was a violation of Xenia, the sacred law of nations, the ancient rule that even enemies respected. It was an act of war so blatant, so personal, it bypassed debate entirely. The legions were mobilized. The fleet was launched. Rome prepared to crush the pirate queen. But as the heavy Roman quinquermes lumbered into the Adriatic, they discovered something terrifying. They weren't fighting a disorganized rabble. They were sailing into a labyrinth, a maze defended by people who knew every current, every hidden cove, every deadly trick for killing a slow-moving giant. And to understand why one diplomat's murder triggered an international crisis, we need to stop staring at Rome's marble columns and look instead at the jagged spine of the ancient Balkans. Because the kingdom of the RDA didn't look like any civilization Rome recognized. No grand forums, no paved roads stretching across the horizon, no philosophers debating under stone arches. Instead, Illyrian power was carved straight into living rock. Geography is destiny, and nowhere was that more true than here. The Dinaric Alps formed a brutal wall separating the coast from the interior, a nightmare for Roman logistics, packed with bottlenecks and ambush points. But for pirates, it was a fortress built by the gods, and the coastline itself was worse. A fractured mosaic of over 1,000 islands, hidden coves, and deep fjord-like bays. Ships could vanish in seconds, swallowed by limestone cliffs that dropped straight into the sea. For the Romans, it was impossible to control. For the Illyrians, it was home, and it shaped everything. The land was stingy. Wheat and olive oil barely grew. Survival required looking outward, toward the rich trade arteries between Greece and Italy. For these tribes, raiding wasn't evil. It was necessary. They harvested merchant fleets the way farmers harvested fields, and over centuries, necessity became culture. Under Agron, the loose collection of tribes became a state apparatus. He didn't just lead raids, he taxed them. He created a system where chieftains supplied ships and warriors in exchange for protection and a share of the spoils. It was a mafia-style protection racket on a geopolitical scale. When Teuta took over as regent for her young stepson, Pin, she inherited that machine. And her position was far more fragile than Rome understood. Because in the hyper-masculine warrior culture of the Illyrians, leadership depended on one thing: wealth. A ruler held power only by distributing gold and slaves to keep the chiefs loyal. If Teuta bowed to Rome and stopped piracy, she would choke off the wealth that held her throne together. The moment she ordered the fleets to dock, she would face mutiny. Her refusal wasn't just pride, it was political survival. And to prove she was strong enough to wear Agron's crown, she pushed harder. She authorized expansion south, targeting Greek colonies. Her commanders besieged Isa. They attacked Epidamnos. And these weren't chaotic raids, they were organized campaigns. The Illyrians used siege engines, coordinated infantry maneuvers, psychological warfare. They terrified the Greeks, not just with brutality, but with discipline. The court at Skadra reflected that mindset. Wine flowed like blood. The Illyrians were infamous for drinking unmixed wine in obscene quantities. Even the Greeks were appalled by it. Their feasts were rowdy, violent affairs where business and brutality blended together. And in this atmosphere of intoxicated aggression, Teuta held court, surrounded by warriors who measured leadership by how much fear you could inflict. Rome saw a barbarian woman, but what they were really facing was a cornered tiger, and she controlled a pirate empire that Rome couldn't simply crush. A decentralized hydra of fortified harbors stretching from modern Split down to Duras. Burn one village, sink one fleet. The rest would vanish into the mountains, or slip behind islands, waiting for the storm to pass. The Romans were bringing a hammer to kill a swarm of wasps, and they were about to learn the hardest lesson of all. Brute force is useless when your enemy refuses to stand still. When the Roman navy finally launched its counterattack, they brought the heavyweight champions of the Mediterranean, the quinquermes. These weren't ships so much as floating fortresses, massive war machines powered by nearly 300 oarsmen, designed to smash through enemy hulls with the force of a battering ram. A single Roman ship was a masterpiece of engineering, and it wasn't just built to fight at sea, it was built to turn naval combat into a land battle. Each vessel carried around 120 Marines, trained killers ready to board, overwhelm, and butcher anyone unlucky enough to be in their path. Against Carthage, this strategy had worked. Brute force, discipline, crushing power. But the Adriatic wasn't the open ocean, and the Illyrians weren't interested in fighting fair. Deep inside the shipyards of the Illyrians, a tribe renowned for naval ingenuity, the Illyrians had perfected a weapon that would quietly change maritime history. They called it the Lembbus, and if the Roman quinquermes were sledgehammers, the Lembbus was a switchblade. It was small, undecked, fast, powered by a single bank of oars with usually only 50 men aboard. No heavy ram, no towering castles, no thick armor. To a Roman admiral, it looked like a toy. And that underestimation was fatal. Because the Lembbus possessed one thing the Romans couldn't replicate: speed. It was built with a shallow draft, meaning it could skim over hidden reefs, dart through narrow channels, and vanish up shallow river deltas where Roman warships would run aground like stranded whales. In the choppy, unpredictable waters along the Dalmatian coast, the Lembbus danced, the quinquermes stumbled, and Illyrian tactics were unlike anything Rome had faced. This was naval guerrilla warfare. They never lined up for the decisive set-piece battles that Romans adored, the kind where victory could be declared with neat speeches and triumphal parades. Instead, they hunted like wolves. 4 or 5 lembi would rush a single Roman transport. They didn't ram, they swarmed. Using speed and coordination, they'd pull alongside, lash the ships together, then flood the Roman deck with fierce infantry before the Marines could even reposition. It was chaos, and it was deadly. But the real nightmare for Rome wasn't just the violence. It was the math. A Roman warship cost a fortune. Months of labor, an enormous crew, a floating investment of state power. A Illyrian Lembbus could be built in weeks from local timber, crewed by fishermen who'd grown up rowing in storms. Teuta could lose 10 ships to sink one Roman vessel and still win the exchange. The Lembbus didn't just dominate the Adriatic, it terrified the merchant world. Reports of raids spread as far south as the Peloponnese. The Illyrians had democratized naval violence. You didn't need an empire's treasury to threaten a superpower. You just needed a fast boat and 50 hungry men. Rome found itself boxing with a shadow. Legions would land on an island only to find villages empty, smoke still rising from abandoned hearths, and the Illyrian fleet already gone, sailing downwind to raid the very supply lines Rome had just left behind. The invincible Roman navy was bleeding from 1,000 paper cuts, and they couldn't pin down an enemy that refused to stand still. The Senate realized, too late, that they weren't fighting a nation. They were fighting a methodology. And to win, Rome would need more than iron and wood. They would need treachery. Because in 229 BC, Rome stopped swatting flies and decided to burn down the forest. The Senate authorized a force so massive it bordered on absurd: 200 warships, 20,000 infantry, led by both consuls at once. This wasn't a police action. This was an annihilation fleet. The Adriatic itself seemed to tremble as the Roman armada crossed the Strait of Otranto, the displacement of water sending a warning through every wooden hull in the region. The message was clear. The game was over. But the Illyrian wars wouldn't be decided by a clash of prows. They would be decided in the mind of one man, Demetrius of Pharos. Demetrius was Queen Teuta's most capable general, a fighter, a strategist, and a man entrusted with defending Corsair, modern-day Corfu, the strategic key to controlling the Adriatic. He commanded a garrison strong enough to hold out for months, bleeding Roman supply lines dry. But Demetrius had a trait common among successful pirates: a total lack of loyalty. His allegiance was not to Teuta, not to Illyria, not to honor. It was to his own survival. As the Roman armada darkened the horizon, blocking out the morning sun, Demetrius did the math. He saw Teuta's regency weakening under the weight of her ambition. He saw the endless resources of Rome, and he saw an opportunity. So instead of ordering archers to the walls, he sent a rowboat to the Roman flagship. The deal was struck in whispers. Demetrius surrendered Corsair without a single drop of blood. In exchange, Rome promised to install him as a client king, ruler over the islands he had once defended for Teuta. It was a master stroke of Roman statecraft. They didn't just defeat the Illyrians, they decapitated them. With Corsair gone, the Illyrian defense line shattered like glass. The Roman legions landed and swept north, moving less like an army and more like a force of nature. City after city threw open their gates: Epidamnos, Apollonia, Issa, all eager to distance themselves from the pirate queen before Rome's wrath reached them. Rome accepted surrender and kept marching, driving Teuta deeper into the wild interior. Teuta retreated to the fortress of Rissyn, tucked deep inside the twisting bay of Carthage, a natural stronghold. But now she was isolated. Her allies defected. Her fleet scattered, and her most trusted general was guiding the Roman legions straight toward her. In 228 BC, Teuta capitulated. The treaty was humiliating. She was forced to abandon her claims on the Greek cities, pay crushing tribute, and most painfully, except a strict limit on her navy. No more than 2 unarmed Illyrian ships were allowed to sail south of Lissus. The pirate empire was effectively grounded. Rome declared victory, gathered their legions, and sailed home. Confident the Illyrian problem was solved, and they left Demetrius of Pharos behind as their puppet, their watchman over the Adriatic. But Rome had forgotten a fundamental rule about wild animals. A wolf that bites its master once will bite again. Demetrius didn't want to be a puppet. He wanted to be a king. And while Rome turned its attention elsewhere, distracted by the rumblings of a new Carthaginian threat, Demetrius sharpened his knives. History rarely offers a perfect villain, but Demetrius comes close. He was the ultimate survivor. A man who treated loyalty like currency, something to spend, never something to save. When Rome became paralyzed by terrifying news that a Carthaginian general named Hannibal was marching war elephants toward the Alps, Demetrius decided the time had come. He had been installed to keep the Adriatic quiet. Instead, he turned it into his private kingdom. Betting Rome was too distracted by Carthage to care about a few broken promises, Demetrius tore up the peace treaty of 228 BC. He didn't just cross the forbidden line at Lissus. He sailed past it with 50 warships, raiding the Cyclades, terrorizing Roman allies in Greece, and it didn't stop at piracy. To secure his position, he married into the royal family of Macedonia, forging an alliance with King Philip V. This was Rome's nightmare, a bridge between the chaotic naval power of the Illyrians and the disciplined phalanxes of the East. Demetrius was no longer just a pirate. He was a geopolitical architect, building an anti-Roman coalition. The Second Illyrian War was Rome's frantic attempt to close the back door before the house caught fire. Because the Senate knew they couldn't fight Hannibal in Italy if their supply lines across the Adriatic were being severed by Demetrius. So they dispatched Lucius Aemilius Paulus, a consul known for grim efficiency, to crush the traitor. And what followed was a masterclass in Roman siege warfare. In a single week, the supposedly impregnable fortress of Naval was stormed and taken. The speed of Rome's advance caught Demetrius off guard. He retreated to his home island of Pharos, confident his fortifications would hold. But the Romans didn't bother with a long siege. They staged a fake landing to draw Demetrius's troops out, and then ambushed them from the rear with a hidden force. Caught in a pincer movement, the king of the Adriatic watched his army evaporate. But true to his nature, Demetrius didn't die with his men. While his soldiers were slaughtered, he slipped away to a waiting ship and fled to the court of Philip V in Macedonia. Rome had won again, securing the Adriatic just in time to face Hannibal, but the victory was incomplete, because Demetrius escaping meant the poison survived. He would spend the rest of his life whispering venom into Philip's ear, urging Macedonia to strike Rome when it was weakest. The pirate had become a kingmaker, and his influence would drag Rome into decades of brutal Eastern conflict. The snake had been chased from the grass, but it had found a larger garden. Fast forward 50 years, to 168 BC, the world had changed. Rome was no longer just a republic. It was the apex predator of the Mediterranean. But in Scadra, a new king named Gentius was about to make the same old mistake. And the Third Illyrian War didn't begin with ambition. It began with a con artist. The king of Macedonia, Perseus, was desperate for allies against Rome's juggernaut. He looked at Gentius and saw a useful idiot. Perseus offered the Illyrian king a staggering bribe, 300 talents of silver, and what followed is one of the most tragic comedies in ancient history. Gentius, wary of empty promises, demanded to see the money first, and Perseus's envoys actually brought the silver to Illyria, allowing Gentius to stamp his royal seal into the wax, safeguarding the treasure. Satisfied, Gentius committed the one act that made betrayal irreversible. He arrested 2 Roman ambassadors and threw them into prison. Point of no return. But the moment news reached Macedonia, Perseus pulled the rug out from under him. He ordered the bearers of silver to turn around and bring the money back home. Because in Perseus's mind, Gentius was now already at war with Rome and didn't need to be paid. Gentius had sold his kingdom for a fortune he never touched, and Rome's response was terrifying. But that's where part 3 begins. Rome's response was terrifying, not just in its brutality, but in its speed. This time the Senate didn't even bother sending a consul. They sent a praetor named Anicius Gallus, and Anicius didn't come to negotiate. He didn't come to intimidate. He came to erase. He launched what can only be described as an ancient blitzkrieg, a campaign so fast it would impress modern generals. The entire war lasted 30 days. Let that sink in. A kingdom that had terrorized the Adriatic for a century was dismantled in a single month. Gentius retreated behind the massive Cyclopean walls of Scodra, hoping they would save him, hoping Rome would slow down, hoping time would somehow produce a miracle. But his army was already collapsing. His treasury was empty. Morale was gone, and the Roman machine did not stop. The end wasn't heroic. It wasn't dramatic. It was pathetic. Gentius asked for a 3-day truce, supposedly to consider his options. But everyone knew what he was really doing. He was waiting, hoping a relief army might appear on the horizon, hoping Perseus would come running back with the silver and the soldiers and the salvation. He spent those 3 days staring toward the distance, likely drinking heavily, watching the horizon like a man watching for a ship that would never come. No one came. When the truce expired, he didn't ride out for a glorious last stand. He didn't die like a king. He walked out of the gates. He fell to his knees in the dust before the Roman praetor, and he begged. Rome was not merciful. The kingdom was dissolved. Gentius and his entire family were shackled and later paraded through the streets of Rome in Anicius's triumph. As the crowds cheered, watching the barbarian king dragged in chains, the independent history of Illyria ended with a whimper. The pirate empire was dead. But for the ordinary people left behind in the Balkans, the real horror was just beginning. Because the war was over, and the exploitation had only just started. When the legions marched home, they didn't leave behind peace. They left behind something far more dangerous than soldiers. They left behind the accountants. Rome didn't take Illyria to build schools. They didn't conquer it to develop roads. They came to drain it. And the Senate applied their favorite geopolitical formula: divide et impera. Divide and rule. The once unified kingdom was sliced into 3 autonomous districts, deliberately separated like a body cut apart so it could never rise again. Rome even banned marriage and trade between these districts. If you were an Illyrian in the north, your cousin in the south might as well have lived on the moon. The goal was simple: destroy the national identity that had produced kings like Agron and queens like Teuta. But political division was only the appetizer. The main course was economic extraction, because the Romans arrived with an insatiable hunger for silver, and the ancient Balkans were sitting on veins of it. To manage that wealth, Rome didn't rely solely on government officials. They outsourced. They leased tax collection and mining operations to private corporations known as the publicani. These were the venture capitalists of the ancient world, except they came armed with swords. They bid for contracts in Rome, paying the state up front. And once they owned the contract, everything else was profit. Every denarius they could squeeze from the provinces above their original bid was money in their pockets. The result was industrial-scale horror, because the Roman provincial economy wasn't fueled by olive oil, it was fueled by human bodies. Thousands of Illyrian warriors, once proud masters of the Adriatic, were marched into the suffocating tunnels of the silver mines. And those mines were slow death. The tunnels were narrow, unventilated, lit only by flickering oil lamps that burned up the oxygen. Men worked in shifts that lasted for days, hammering stone while inhaling silica dust that turned their lungs into stone. If the rock didn't kill you, the brutality did. The publicani employed private security forces who enforced quotas with whips and clubs. There was no oversight, no mercy, no rights. There was only the quota, and the silver extracted from those hills paved Rome's streets, funded the gladiator games, and financed the luxuries of the empire. But back in Illyria, the Pax Romana, the so-called Roman peace, felt like a suffocating blanket. The publicani seized land, confiscated livestock, taxed everything, from the number of columns in your home to the number of slaves you owned. And if you couldn't pay, you became the commodity. For over a century, the pressure built. The Illyrians were beaten, divided, enslaved, but they were not broken. Because beneath the surface, deep in mountain passes, in forests where Roman collectors didn't dare wander, the old stories still lived. The memory of the Lembbus, the freedom of the sea, the defiance of their ancestors. It didn't disappear. It went underground. Rome thought it was managing a conquered province. In reality, it was sitting on a powder keg, and the fuse was burning. By 6 AD, Rome wasn't just a republic anymore. It was an empire, ruled by the first emperor, Augustus. On paper, the world looked stable, but in the mountains of Illyria, the pressure cooker was about to explode. And the spark wasn't a brutal beating. It wasn't a starving slave. It was a recruitment drive. Rome was preparing a massive invasion of Germany, and they needed bodies. So they turned to their warlike subjects in the Balkans and demanded auxiliary troops. The Illyrians gathered as ordered. They stood in formation, holding Roman-issued swords, wearing Roman armor, drilled in Roman tactics. But as they stared at the Roman officers barking commands, a dangerous thought spread through the ranks like fire. We are armed, we are trained, and there are more of us than them. The rebellion didn't begin with a whisper. It began with a roar. Led by a chieftain named Bat the Ditchiote, the Illyrians turned their weapons on their officers. Within days, the revolt spread across the mountains like wildfire in drought. Another leader, Batau of the Bruce, joined the cause. The two bats united the tribes in a way neither Agron nor Teuta ever could. This became the Bellum Baton Arnum, the War of the Bay. And this wasn't a distant border skirmish. This was an existential crisis. The rebels weren't just defending their homes, they were marching toward Italy. Panic gripped Rome. For the first time in centuries, the Senate debated in terror. Augustus, usually calm, controlled, almost emotionless, stood before the Senate and declared that unless drastic measures were taken, the enemy could be within sight of Rome in 10 days. The empire mobilized completely. Rome stripped provinces of garrisons. They bought freedom for thousands of slaves just to fill uniforms. The future Emperor Tiberius was recalled from Germany to lead the defense, and what followed became the most brutal conflict Rome would fight until the barbarian invasions centuries later. Rome ultimately deployed 15 legions, over half of their entire military strength, plus an equal number of auxiliaries, nearly 200,000 men, to crush a piece of land the size of modern Bosnia. The war dragged on for 3 bloody years. The Illyrians fought with the ferocity of people who knew this was their last chance. They used the terrain like a weapon, luring Roman columns into mountain ambushes, cutting supply lines, vanishing into forests. Rome couldn't win decisively in battle, so they won by starvation. Tiberius adopted a scorched earth policy: burn every village, slaughter every herd, destroy every crop. Finally, in 9 AD, the Decidiate surrendered at the fortress of Andetrium. And when Tiberius demanded to know why the rebellion had been so savage, Batau delivered one of the most cutting lines in history. "You Romans are to blame, for you send as guardians of your flocks not dogs or shepherds, but wolves." The revolt was crushed, but the cost was astronomical, and Rome learned something it would never forget. The Illyrians weren't just rebels. They were the toughest fighters in the known world. So Rome did what it always did when brute force failed. It adapted. Instead of trying to destroy that spirit, Rome decided to buy it. 2 centuries later, the Roman Empire wasn't ruling the world. It was being eaten alive. This was the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year nightmare of civil war, plague, economic collapse, and invasion from every direction. The Senate's soft elites were helpless. The empire fractured into 3 rival states. The end of Rome looked inevitable. But salvation didn't come from Italy. It came from the limestone hills of the Balkans. After the Great Revolt, Rome had learned to recruit the Illyrians. The legions filled with men from Dalmatia and Pannonia, men raised in hardship, men who worshipped soldier gods, men who viewed war as the natural state of the world. By the mid-3rd century, the Roman army was effectively an Illyrian army, and since the army now chose the emperor, the barbarians effectively took the throne.